One community in Henrico County had a boil water advisory for 2 weeks. Families with young kids couldn't use their tap water. Not because of actual contamination, because of a data gap that made it impossible to confirm the water was safe. My boss fired me and gave my job to his 23-year-old nephew. But I'd spent 9 years making sure that position was a trap for anyone who wasn't me. He pulled the trigger. I built the gun. But let me start from the beginning. I need to be honest about something before I tell this story. We all want to be the good guy in our own story, right? I've been telling myself a clean version of what happened for over a year now. But that's not really what happened. I was the IT director at Corbin and Sharp Consulting in Richmond, Virginia. 9 years. Started as a junior systems admin in 2015, worked my way up to running everything. Servers, security infrastructure, compliance audits. Around year 5, so this would have been 2020, right when COVID had everyone working remote, I built a custom compliance monitoring system for our biggest client. A $2.3 million annual contract with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. That system tracked environmental data across the state. Water contamination levels, air quality readings, industrial discharge monitoring. When a factory exceeded its permitted pollution levels, my system flagged it. When a municipal water supply needed testing, my system scheduled it. The DEQ used our reports to decide which communities needed intervention. This wasn't some boring spreadsheet thing. Real people's drinking water depended on this data being accurate and current. I built it from scratch. Tens of thousands of lines of custom Python and SQL, interfacing with 3 government databases with an air-gapped backup that met federal security requirements. And here's where I need to be honest. I didn't document it well. Not because I was lazy, because I chose not to. I told myself it was because the system was too complex. Too many edge cases, too many undocumented government API quirks that you could only learn through experience. But the real reason, I knew that as long as that system lived in my head, I was unfireable. Every time I thought about writing proper runbooks, a voice in the back of my head would go, "Why would you make yourself replaceable?" So I wrote just enough documentation to pass internal audits, and I kept the rest locked away in my memory. 9 years of institutional knowledge, deliberately hoarded. I know how that sounds, but it matters for what comes next. My boss, Regional VP Marcus Calloway, never understood what I did. IT was a line item to him. I kept the lights on, he signed my budget. That was our entire relationship. Then, in March 2025, a Tuesday, I remember because I had a dentist appointment that afternoon. I never made it to Marcus called me into conference room B. HR was already there. Donna slid a folder across the table. Restructuring. My role was being eliminated, effective immediately. 8 weeks of severance. A standard NDA. I signed it. Don't even remember reading most of it. Security walked me out. I packed 9 years into a single box in 20 minutes. My coffee was still warm on my desk. That's the detail that sticks with me for some reason. About a week later, I ran into my former colleague Raj at Lamplighter, this coffee shop near Carytown. He looked uncomfortable, but he told me what actually happened. Marcus had hired his nephew Dylan into my exact role. 23 years old, communications degree, no technical background. The kid's LinkedIn listed Microsoft Office and social media management as his top skills. And he was now responsible for a system that interfaced with 3 government databases and required security clearance to access. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was satisfaction. And that's the part I'm not proud of. Because I knew what was coming. I knew nobody could run that system without me. I had made sure of that over 9 years. So I went home and I waited. Not because I'm some patient strategist playing chess. Because I'd spent a decade building a trap that I always told myself was just job security, and now it was about to spring. I started interviewing immediately. Within 2 weeks, I accepted a position at Meridian Technologies, a direct competitor. Director of Infrastructure, 20% raise, better benefits, the whole package. My attorney confirmed Virginia doesn't enforce non-competes for employees terminated without cause. I started April 1st. Now here's what I didn't expect. I thought Dylan would crash and burn within days. He didn't. For the first 2 weeks, things ran fine. The system I'd built was robust. Automated processes kept churning, daily reports generated on schedule, backups completed without errors, alerts pinged the right inboxes. I'd built it well and it could handle the routine without human intervention. Raj told me later that Dylan was actually enthusiastic, asking questions, reorganizing the shared drive, setting up a new ticketing system for IT requests. Small stuff, but it showed real effort. He was trying. I remember sitting at my new desk at Meridian thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe the system would hold. Maybe I wasn't as critical as I'd convinced myself. That messed with my head more than I want to admit. Then week 3 happened. Dylan decided to update the admin credentials on the compliance server. Reasonable security practice, honestly. The kind of thing you're supposed to do when there's a personnel change. But he locked out the 2 remaining IT staff who ran daily operations. Normally a simple fix, except the fix involved a manual workaround I'd never documented. It existed because of a quirk in the DEQ's legacy API from 2019 that forced a specific authentication handshake. You'd only know about it if you were there when it first broke. I was, and I never wrote it down. That cascaded. With the team locked out for 2 days, routine maintenance got skipped. Dylan tried to clean things up himself and started removing what looked like redundant data files. They weren't redundant. They were archived compliance records. Environmental monitoring data that federal retention policy required the state to keep for 7 years. Water quality readings from treatment plants. Soil contamination tests from Superfund adjacent sites. Industrial discharge logs from facilities along the James River. He didn't delete them out of recklessness. He deleted them because my documentation described them only as system-generated archives, which was technically accurate. But I deliberately left out that they were legally protected system-generated archives subject to federal retention mandates. Because writing that down would have made someone else capable of understanding what mattered and what didn't. And I never wanted anyone else to have that understanding. The automated weekly report to the DEQ failed on day 14. First failure in 6 years. Nobody caught it for 3 days because Dylan had muted the monitoring alerts. And honestly, I get it. I'd configured those alerts to be deliberately obnoxious, like pinging every 15 minutes obnoxious because I was the one receiving them and I wanted to never miss one at 3 in the morning. Without that context, muting them was a reasonable decision by someone trying to actually focus on his work. Wrong but reasonable. And this is where everything collapses. If you're invested in this, hit subscribe, we drop new ones daily. Day 19. A state auditor ran a routine spot check. The compliance data was corrupted. The air-gapped backup, the one failsafe I'd engineered specifically for this kind of catastrophe, was also compromised. Dylan had connected it to the main network so he could access files from his laptop. Look, the air-gap protocol was a multi-step manual process that I had documented, but the documentation referenced 4 other internal documents that cross-referenced each other in a maze that honestly, even I sometimes had to trace through carefully. The Virginia DEQ issued a formal notice of non-compliance and terminated the contract within 72 hours. $2.3 million in annual revenue gone. And that brings us to what I told you about at the start. That system monitored real environmental compliance for real places where real people live. When the data was corrupted, the DEQ lost 3 months of water quality data for 11 rural monitoring stations across central Virginia. They had to deploy emergency testing teams to sites that might have had contamination events that went completely unrecorded during the gap. Nobody got sick as far as I know, but they could have. And not just because Marcus put an unqualified person in the chair. Because I spent 9 years making absolutely sure that chair was a trap for anyone who wasn't me. At Meridian, I threw myself into building a better compliance system. Real architecture, real documentation. A team of 4 instead of 1 person hoarding everything in his head. At about 2 months in, I made my own mistake. I was migrating a client's legacy database and I cut a corner. Skipped the full validation pass because I was confident I knew the data schema from a similar project. I was wrong. Corrupted about 6 weeks of transaction records. My team caught it before it reached production, but barely. My manager pulled me aside and I braced for the manila folder moment all over again. Instead, she said that's why we have review processes and told me to slow down. I sat in my car in the parking garage afterward for probably 20 minutes, not moving, thinking about Dylan. Whether anyone at Corbin and Sharp had ever just told him something like that, instead of watching him drown and then blaming him for not knowing how to swim. Some of Corbin and Sharp's other clients did leave after the DEQ disaster became public. Government contract failures are public record in Virginia, and when your IT vendor loses a major state contract over data integrity issues, you start asking questions about your own data. A few of those clients ended up at Meridian. They knew me. They trusted me from years of managing their accounts. When they called asking if Meridian could handle their workload, I said yes without hesitating. I won't dress that up as coincidence. It's not poaching technically, but it's not some karmic accident either. I benefited directly from a disaster I helped set the conditions for. The combined value of those contracts was over $4 million. Revenue that walked out of Corbin and Sharp's front door and into ours. Marcus was pushed out by June. The Richmond office bled clients for months. It was eventually absorbed into a larger consulting firm, and the physical office on Broad Street was closed. I'm 18 months into Meridian now. Got promoted to VP of Technology last October. The compliance system I rebuilt has real documentation, real handoff procedures, a real team maintaining it. Nobody is indispensable. That was the whole point. But last month I was reviewing our disaster recovery plan and I caught myself doing it again. Writing documentation that was just vague enough. Keeping one section slightly unclear so that you'd need to come ask me to really understand it. 9 years of habit doesn't just disappear because you had some big realization. I stared at what I'd written for a long time. Then I rewrote it that afternoon. Clear, complete, followable by anyone on the team without picking up the phone. I don't really think about Marcus anymore. Guy made his bed. I think about Dylan sometimes though. Not with satisfaction like I used to. More like the way you think about someone who got handed a live grenade and didn't know what it was. He was 23. His uncle told him he had a great opportunity. He said yes. Most people would. I keep circling back to this. If Marcus hadn't fired me, I'd still be there. Still hoarding knowledge. Still telling myself that my documentation strategy was just being thorough, just being careful, when really it was about control. And eventually that system would have failed anyway. Maybe not as dramatically. Maybe not with a 23-year-old nephew at the wheel. But a system built around one person's brain is a system waiting to break. I just didn't want to see that when I was the one person. I'm not the hero of this story. I'm not the villain either. Somewhere in between. And I think most of us are when we're actually being honest about it. If you've ever been in a situation where something fell apart and you had to sit with knowing you were part of why I want to hear about it. Those stories are harder to tell than the ones where you're just the victim and karma handles everything. But they are more honest. Drop it in the comments. And if this is the kind of story that makes you think, hit subscribe because we don't do fairy tales on this channel.